A generous soul.
She was a very giving person and a very sharing person.
Who helped neighbors in need.
When they needed extra money for baby food or diapers, Janora was always there.
Is found brutally murdered.
This homicide was one of the most violent homicides that I've worked.
There was blood from basically the floor to the ceiling.
It was something that shocked the community.
Police uncover a sinister trail of deception and hate.
He had some strange tendencies. He seemed to be stalking her.
The polygraph came back with some clear signs that he was being deceptive.
To unveil a killer no one expected.
He made her believe that he was her knight in shining armor, so she never saw it coming.
He had two completely different faces on him. He was just the devil incarnate.
One hot summer morning in the sleepy rural town of Clinton, Louisiana, the sheriff's office gets a call that sends them to a farmhouse just outside of town. It belongs to a woman named Janora Guillory.
When Janora didn't show up for work on Monday morning, her coworkers started to get nervous. They called her cell phone. She didn't answer. They called her landline, and it was busy, stayed busy. At that point, a friend at work called the sheriff's office in East Feliciana and said, "Would you please go check on our coworker, Janora Guillory?"
The deputy that worked for the East Feliciana Sheriff's Office, and he went to the residence to look for her. The door was unlocked. And he discovered the body.
He backed out of the house, and he said he threw up outside. He could barely even speak to the dispatcher. He was so upset by what he found.
Detectives are called to the scene.
You could tell something had happened at the very entrance of the door. There was blood right there on the door handle.
The blood on the floor leads detectives inside the house.
There, you could follow the blood trail, and it went into the kitchen. There were several knives that had blood on them inside of the drawer. There was also evidence like someone tried to use the phone, and there was blood on the side of the phone.
The blood leads to the bedroom, where detectives are met with a gruesome sight. In the middle of the floor lies the lifeless body of 42-year-old Janora Guillory.
You could see evident tears in her skin, which, we knew at the time were deep stab wounds. She was beaten severely. There was blood from basically the floor to the ceiling.
The lamp was broken and stuff knocked over in the bedroom.
I've seen other homicides that I've worked that this one was more brutal.
The body was also half closed, legs opened, and she was pinned against the wall. There was a possibility that she had been raped.
Detectives in this small parish don't investigate many homicides, let alone one this brutal. They call in the Louisiana State Police to help process the scene.
They took some DNA samples of the material that was found under her fingernails.
The samples are sent to the lab to see if there are any traces of the killer's DNA.
We didn't find any type of murder weapons. We found that it was actually no forced entry. We pretty well figured that it was somebody that she knew and had a little bit of trust in to open the door.
As police collect evidence, Janora's neighbors, Philip and Amy Skipper, arrive on the scene.
They was, of course, shocked. Philip's wife, Amy, she was really destroyed, and she was a friend of Miss Guillory's.
Police informed Janora's family. Her brother-in-law, Albert, is the first to get the terrible news.
I received a call from the sheriff's office indicating that Janora was dead, had been murdered, and obviously it was just an unbelievably bad moment. To Janora's sister, my spouse at that time, Yvonne, that was probably the single most devastating moment in her life.
The family rushes to the scene. When they arrive, detectives ask them for any details they can provide about Janora.
Janora grew up in Eunice, Louisiana, a small town in St. Landry Parish. From the time that Janora was a young girl in school, she was a very giving person. She was a very intelligent woman, filled with love for life, filled with love for animals.
Janora worked at an insurance company in Baton Rouge, but chose to live in rural Clinton, where she could indulge in her passion for animals.
She had 30 dogs, she had 3 or 4 horses, she had rescue animals, she took care of friends' animals if they couldn't. Animals were a big part of her life.
Friends were a big part of Janora's life too. She was thrilled when a sweet couple moved in across the street, and they immediately hit it off.
Philip and Amy Skipper moved into her neighborhood, and I felt very comfortable that she had developed this warm relationship with the Skippers.
Over the years, Janora and her neighbors became close friends.
Janora told me how reliable they were and how hardworking they were.
Janora really liked her neighbors, and she thought of the Skippers almost like family.
Now her friends are heartbroken over Janora's violent death, and police are faced with the puzzle of finding her killer.
It made no sense. Janora had no enemies, and she wasn't involved in anything shady or suspicious.
When the autopsy report comes back the next day, it concludes that the murder took place between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. It also reveals just how brutal Janora's final moments were. She was shot 5 times with a .22 caliber gun and stabbed 5 times. But neither of these attacks caused her death.
A severe blow to the back of the head severed her brainstem from her body. She was actually alive, and she was fighting back and was stabbed and shot.
This was one of the most violent homicides that I've worked. It was a very much overkill, which usually means it is a crime of passion.
This was a particularly brutal, dastardly deed. We all stood outside Janora's house that morning and talked about who could possibly have done this.
Despite the concern of Janora's family and friends, detectives can't rule out anyone as a suspect.
We began talking to the neighbors and co-workers, the ones that showed up, and just started trying to get information.
One person in particular draws investigators' attention: Janora's neighbor, Philip Skipper.
Philip was real calm. What really got me was his over wanting to help too much, you know. We just had a feeling Philip knew something.
Coming up, investigators uncover a dark obsession.
he was infatuated with her and couldn't take no for an answer.
And menacing secrets.
They called her names behind her back all the time, but never to her face.
There was an incentive for them to actually murder her.
That leads them to a suspect they never expected.
They went on a tour of the murder scene, and he described the whole thing.
He just blurted out, "Do you have a woman named Mrs. G that was murdered over there?"
After 42-year-old Janora Guillory is found savagely killed in her home, detectives in Clinton, Louisiana suspect that her neighbor, Philip Skipper, might know something about the murder.
Philip was over helpful at the crime scene, and it is something that we wanted to check out more.
Police decide to bring in Philip Skipper and his wife, Amy, for an interview.
Janora really liked her neighbors, and the Skippers had a young child and their stepson, who was 15 years old at the time.
Philip Skipper tells investigators that when his young family first moved to Clinton, they were down on their luck, but their neighbor Janora kindly helped out.
She started to take them under her umbrella and make sure that they had food and made sure that they had electricity.
When the Skippers needed extra money for baby food or diapers, Janora was always there. The trailer they were living in, for example, was really dilapidated, so Janora helped them buy a new trailer. She helped them improve their lives as much as she could.
Janora's kindness didn't stop there.
She started to employ Philip to do all of the work in her yard and around the house, and employed Amy Skipper to do the work inside her house.
Janora treated the Skippers like family and trusted them with keys to her property.
She was just a very, very generous neighbor.
Detectives want to know if the Skippers ever argued with Janora. Amy Skipper said their relationship had recently been strained by an unfortunate incident.
Philip Skipper was raising pit bulls, and there was one dog that was not a pit that didn't get along with his other pit bulls, and Janora agreed to keep that in her kennel with her dogs. Well, that dog somehow got loose during the day while Janora was at work. The dog ran back to the Skipper's trailer and killed a goat. They kept as a pet. Amy Skipper ran over to Janora's house, got on the phone, called Janora at work, and was upset with Janora. And that's witnessed by a couple of Janora's co-workers who heard Janora's end of the conversation. She was crying by the end of this phone call. That's how upset Janora was. And Janora told Amy Skipper on the phone, "Leave the key at my house, get out of my house, and never come back."
When police question Philip about the conflict, he tells them that he and Amy had since patched things up with Janora, and they were back on friendly terms.
Philip Skipper was dismissive about the falling out. He said it was just a dispute among neighbors, and they worked it out, and there was no lingering after effects.
Police are skeptical about Philip's version of events, and when they notice scratches on his arms, they wonder if they were made by Janora while trying to fight for her life.
Questioned him about that. He said it was from him and his stepson wrestling in the yard.
Not convinced by his story, investigators ask Philip where he was on the night of the murder.
And he said he was asleep at the time that the murder happened.
To confirm Philip's story, police ask to interview his 15-year-old stepson, John Ballio.
When you interview at the juvenile in Louisiana, you have to have permission of the guardian or the parent. which we had. I mean, they did cooperate there and let us talk to them.
When detectives questioned John, they noticed scratches on his arms too. Is it possible Genora fought back against two attackers?
John Ballio had marks on him. He gave us the same story.
John corroborates his stepdad's story. But police are still suspicious.
The marks on their arms was really something that we wanted to check out more if they was being truthful. So after that interview, we did decide to have a polygraph set up.
Philip and John agree to take the test, but before it can be scheduled, investigators uncover a critical detail.
During the course of the investigation, we did learn about an insurance policy Miss Guillory had taken out on herself, and the money would go to the skippers.
Was an insurance payout reason enough for the skippers to kill their friend and neighbor?
With a lack of motive, it's really hard to find the killer.
The insurance policy was an incentive for them to actually murder her.
Police have just discovered that murder victim Genora Guillory's neighbors, the Skipper family, are the beneficiaries of Genora's $25,000 life insurance policy.
And it's just kind of unusual that the neighbor would have an insurance policy and list the other neighbor as a beneficiary. They're not related.
The insurance policy raises eyebrows for investigators, but Genora's family is well aware of the policy and does not suspect foul play.
Genora wanted to make sure that the Skippers had the food that they needed, had the clothing that they needed for at least a period of time, should she meet an untimely departure. The Skippers, after Genora's death, did not know how to collect. They contacted me and asked me to assist them, and I did.
Still, police believe the insurance money is a possible motive. That, coupled with the scratches on Philip and John's arms, convinces detectives to take the next step.
Philip Skipper and John Ballio showed up at the Baton Rouge Police Department, which has a polygraphy unit, and they both took separate polygraph tests.
The polygraph interrogator asked 15-year-old John Ballio for an alibi.
John Ballio said he was at home asleep when the murders occurred.
Both John and Philip are asked about their knowledge of the murder by the examiner. And when their responses are analyzed, detectives are surprised by the results.
Both of their tests came back with no real signs of deception.
The results on the polygraphs, they was inconclusive, and the officer that was doing the polygraph didn't think that they had done the murder.
The results are a blow to the investigation, and lead detectives drop the Skippers as suspects.
We still didn't have no physical evidence, and the polygraph made us think, well, we need to start looking elsewhere.
Detectives interview Genora's friends and coworkers about anyone she may have dated recently.
The friend of Miss Guillory's did give us the name of Tommy Alexandra.
Police track down Tommy at his home in a nearby town. He agrees to talk to police. Tommy tells investigators that he met Genora months prior at a feed store where she was stocking up on food for her animals. Genora agreed to meet Tommy for a drink, their first of several dates.
Tommy and Genora had dated on and off for some time.
But it soon became apparent to Genora that Tommy had other love interests.
It turned out Tommy Alexander was not just dating Janora at the time. He was dating a couple of different women.
Janora really liked him, but Tommy didn't want to settle down. He wasn't going to commit to one woman.
Is it possible that an argument between Janora and Tommy could have turned deadly?
We interviewed Tommy about the homicide.
On the night Janora was murdered, Tommy says that he was at home. Police talk to his girlfriend, who confirms his alibi.
They were able to eventually eliminate him as a suspect. As far as physical evidence to tie a specific suspect to the scene, there really wasn't anything. They kept trying to dig for facts, but they were hampered by the fact that, once again, they couldn't figure out why anyone wanted to kill her.
Determined to get justice for Janora, investigators interview her coworkers and discover that she had an ongoing conflict with a man in her life.
We learned about another friend, Steve Williams, from co-workers, and basically what we learned is that he wanted to date Miss Guillory.
But the feeling is not mutual.
Steve Williams managed to persuade Janora to go out one time, and that was enough for her. She didn't want to go out with him again, and she let him know. But he didn't take that no very well.
Miss Guillory had really got concerned about him, according to her friends. He would sit out in the parking lot and wait for her to get off from work, would show up unannounced.
Steve Williams showed up out of the blue while she was working her horses.
He pursued her a little more aggressively than was comfortable for the family.
From co-workers' explanations over there, he seemed to be stalking Janora.
Janora said, "He's bothering me and he needs to stop."
When detectives look into Steve Williams, they're shocked to learn that their potential suspect is one of their own.
Steve Williams was a Baton Rouge police officer.
Detectives have learned that Steve Williams, who had been repeatedly contacting Janora Guillory in the months before her murder, is a fellow police officer.
Steve Williams had recently gotten a job with the Baton Rouge Police Department, and he was a probationary police officer in the next jurisdiction over.
He was infatuated with her, and he was just a guy who couldn't take no for an answer.
Janora's friends knew that she was not interested, and of course after the murder, when the police are asking, well, who may have been upset with Janora, he became a focus of the investigation.
When you investigate law enforcement officers, it's harder than most because they know the law as good as you do. But we did have good cooperation through Baton Rouge City Police Department. Whatever we needed, they was willing to provide.
As investigators gather more information about Steve, they uncover an intriguing tip from one of his colleagues, 29-year-old officer Tabitha McCants.
Tabitha came forward during the investigation, and she had worked with Steve Williams at Baton Rouge Police Office.
It turns out she got kind of a bad vibe from him.
Tabitha tells investigators that she overheard Steve having heated phone conversations with a woman on several occasions while at the police shooting range.
She said they make multiple phone calls.
Police need to check Janora's phone records to find out if Janora was the person Steve had been calling. Tabitha also tells investigators that Steve mentioned shooting targets at his mother's home. And when they ask Tabitha if Steve mentioned the type of gun he used, her answer sets off alarm bells.
She says he used a .22, which by this time we found out that a .22 was used in the shooting of Miss Guillory.
As a police officer, of course, Steve Williams had firearms. The .22 caliber pistol, which is certainly not a police gun, but he did have a .22, and he shot it at his mother's house.
Based on the history of him stalking Miss Guillory and the access to a .22, that's when we decided that we would check Steve Williams out a little bit more.
When detectives check Janora's phone records, they quickly discover an alarming pattern.
Looking at the phone records, Steve Williams, in my opinion, was stalking Miss Guillory.
The phone records showed 35 calls to Janora's home from the shooting range in 4 months, and an escalating pattern of calls and messages.
Steve Williams had left several messages for Janora the weekend that she was killed. In fact, he told her in a message that he was stopped by her house on the day she was killed.
Investigators don't waste a second bringing Steve in for questioning, and when they do, his demeanor has them instantly suspicious.
Steve was real nervous. It was just something about him, like he was hiding something from us.
Steve insists he had nothing to do with Janora's murder, and claims he stayed at his mother's house the night Janora was killed.
Steve's mama's residence about 40 minutes away from where the homicide was.
Police believe Janora was murdered between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Could Steve have slipped out undetected while his mother was sleeping?
Janora was shot with a .22 caliber pistol, and the fact that he had a .22 was nearby on the day she was killed, it really put him very high up on the suspect list.
That's when we had him take a polygraph.
Steve's answers are analyzed, and the results sent to detectives.
Steve Williams' polygraph examination came back with some clear signs that he was possibly being deceptive.
His polygraph basically told us that he may have known something about the murder. Made me really think that he had something to do with this. That's when Steve advised he wasn't going to talk to us no more. He wanted a lawyer.
Despite Steve's refusal to cooperate, detectives continued to investigate him.
He looked like a good suspect. Now the question would be, can they find the evidence to prove it? They got a warrant for his house, they got warrants for his personal cars, and they got a warrant for his police car. Now, to do that, they had to work with the Baton Rouge Police Department. And the detectives were hoping to recover a .22, knife, anything with bloodstains, anything to link him to the crime scene. They didn't find anything.
It's a major setback. But detectives still have one last piece of forensic evidence that they believe could connect Steve Williams to the murder. They get a search warrant for a DNA sample from Steve to see if it's a match for genetic material found on Janora's body.
We had those fingernail scrapings that were taken off her from the State Police Crime Lab.
It was determined, yes, there was some male DNA under her fingernails.
Coming up, investigators zero in on a vicious killer.
I picked out the worst photo that I could find of the crime scene, and I threw it in front of his face and made him look at it and said, did she deserve it?
Police hope to use DNA evidence to link Baton Rouge police officer Steve Williams to Janora Guillory's murder. Steve's DNA is compared to material found under Janora's fingernails.
His DNA was not actually determined to be under her fingernails.
The DNA also doesn't match any known criminals in the FBI database.
The fingernail scrapings came back to a known male genetic profile.
With no physical evidence linking Steve Williams to the crime, he's ruled out as a suspect, leaving investigators at a standstill.
The case had gone cold, and they had no other leads to check into.
The case stays cold for an entire year.
There was great disappointment and great frustration on the part of the family when the case went cold.
The shock of Janora's murder may have faded, but the community lives in fear of a killer who's still at large.
When a murder occurs, it's very alarming. Everybody's on edge, especially after the case was at a standstill.
Then, on July 27th, 2001, a tip comes in that changes everything.
And I got a call on the telephone straight to the office. It was Detective Mark Ackerson from Tangipahoa Sheriff's Office. And he just blurted out, he's like, "You have a woman named Mrs. G that was murdered over there?" And I just kind of looked over at Don and I said, "Yeah, we do have a woman named Miss G that was killed."
The detective there was working a domestic violence battery, and the victim had came in and told him that her boyfriend knew something about a murder in Clinton.
The woman tells detectives her boyfriend's name is Donnie Fisher.
We rode over there and found Donnie Fisher. We brought him over there to the Tangipahoa Sheriff's Office.
But Donnie Fisher is not in the mood to talk.
You could tell he knew something. That's when I picked out the worst photo that I could find of the crime scene. And I threw it in front of his face and made him look at it and said, "Did she deserve it?"
Reluctantly, Donnie looks down at the gruesome photos, and moments later, his whole demeanor changes.
He started to break down and cry. And he looked at it and then he told us, basically, his confession.
Donnie says he heard a detailed account of the murder from one of Janora's neighbors.
The neighbor took Donnie Fisher on a tour of the murder scene.
He said once they got there, he took them and said, "This is how it happened."
Investigators are stunned. They question all of Janora's neighbors at the outset of the investigation, but it didn't uncover any useful information or lead to an arrest. Detectives demand that Donnie reveal the neighbor's name.
He said it was John Ballio, Philip Skipper's stepson.
Detectives are shocked. They press Donnie for details, and he claims that John told him about the murder while cleaning up Janora Guillory's house.
Janora Guillory's family had hired John Ballio to go clean up the crime scene. Donnie Fisher, he was out there helping, so as they're cleaning up the house, John Ballio was bragging to Donnie Fisher about how he killed Janora Guillory. John Ballio took Donnie and said, "Here's what we did here, here's what we did here," and he described the whole thing.
Investigators don't know whether to believe Donnie's story, especially since John Ballio's polygraph was considered truthful. Yet every word of it lines up with the evidence.
John actually showed Donnie how Miss G ran through the house, and talking to Donnie, he described everything that we'd put together from what we seen at the crime scene.
Detectives want to know, why would Ballio want Janora dead after all she had done for his family?
Miss Guillory would rather help somebody than hurt somebody. She would do anything she could to help the Skippers.
It's kind of heartbreaking.
Police now believe that Donnie is telling the truth, so they quickly file an arrest warrant.
We picked up John Ballio late on a Friday evening, and we brought him back to East Police Center Sheriff's Office for charges of first-degree murder.
Investigators now believe the key to cracking this case is a confession from the alleged killer. Luckily, a recent change in Louisiana state law allows them to question a minor accused of murder without a lawyer or guardian present.
The police had to get John Ballio to come clean and tell the truth.
We brought him to my office and I advised him of his rights.
He bounced from here to there during his statements at first when we initially questioned him. And then we started talking about the brutality of this homicide.
After probably an hour and a half interviewing, he finally came and told the story about how he killed Miss G.
But first, Ballio needs to get something off his chest.
He didn't do it by himself.
Pointed the finger right back at Philip Skipper.
Detectives are speechless. John Ballio just implicated his stepdad, Philip, in the murder of Janora Guillory. And that's not all.
He pointed to several other people, too.
Detectives in Clinton, Louisiana have just arrested Philip Skipper's stepson, John Ballio, for the murder of 42-year-old Janora Guillory.
John started basically telling us how this went down.
And John claims he didn't act alone. He points the finger at his stepdad, Philip Skipper, and two other people.
Johnny Hoyt was a brother-in-law to Philip Skipper, and Lisa Skipper Hoyt was a sister to Philip Skipper. He said they killed this woman together.
Lisa and Johnny, that's the first time their name had ever came up. And we were, of course, shocked.
John Ballio gave a detailed confession on videotape to exactly what happened.
John claims that Philip, Johnny, and Lisa had formed a white supremacist gang called the Brotherhood, and that killing Janora was meant to be John's initiation into the group.
It would be much contested Brotherhood.
It was a skinhead gang. Actually, they were very anti-black and neo-Nazi.
Philip Skipper, he had two completely different faces on him. I mean, he had the one he presented to Janora Guillory, which was, the nice neighbor. And then behind her back, he called her all kind of names. He hated black people.
He basically made her believe that he was her knight in shining armor. She never saw it coming.
Killing Janora would not only initiate Ballio into their gang, but also bring a financial windfall.
Philip Skipper was smart enough to figure out that, hey, if she doesn't like us anymore, it's not going to be very long before she changes that insurance policy and names someone else as beneficiary.
Ballio tells detectives that on the night of the murder, the group had been drinking heavily. They arrived at Janora's door at 2 a.m.
When we got there, Lisa walked up to the door and knocked on it and told Miss G that she needed some money to get the baby some diapers.
And Miss G cracked the door open. That's when Johnny hit her and forced his way in there.
They just jumped on her like a pack of hyenas.
She ran through the house, down the hall, screaming for him to leave her alone. Then she ran into the kitchen and got to the knife drawer trying to get her knife so she could cut him to make him leave her alone.
Eventually, she ran to her bedroom.
turns stabbing her, and they took turns beating her, and they took turns shooting her.
And then somebody threw the final blow that, according to the medical examiner, killed her instantly. It was a blow with a bat to the head.
Philip started hitting her with the bat. And after Miss G stopped breathing, they started raping her.
John Ballio said that they used condoms. There was not an indication of any seminal fluid or any semen at the scene that night.
With no evidence to back up John Ballio's claim of sexual assault, the rape charges are dropped. But detectives are still determined to bring Janora's killers to justice.
John Ballio's confession gave us enough probable cause to make sure this case got prosecuted.
For cooperating with police, John is given a deal. He pleads guilty to second-degree murder and receives a juvenile life sentence to expire when he turns 21. Lisa Hoyt also takes a plea agreement and is sentenced to 25 years. That leaves Johnny Hoyt and Philip Skipper to face justice in separate trials. When news of the arrests gets out, Janora's family is devastated.
When the family found that Philip and John were involved, they were really, really upset and angry that the people that Janora had taken care of so diligently were the ones involved in her murder.
The prosecutors are determined to bring Janora's killers to justice. But they have a problem. There's no concrete evidence linking either Philip or Johnny to the crime scene.
There was some male DNA under her fingernails, but it did not match the samples that we had from the 3 males in this case.
Both cases rest entirely on the testimony of John Ballio.
John Ballio walked us through what happened that night, and that was crucial for our case. He actually brought everything together, and it made the whole situation make sense to a jury. It was Philip Skipper's trial. The jury came back with a unanimous verdict. He was guilty of second-degree murder.
Philip Skipper is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Philip's wife, Amy, is not charged with any crime.
A lot of times people ask, what about Amy? What about Amy? Amy Skipper had no idea what her husband was doing.
I genuinely believe that Amy Skipper did not have any knowledge of what was going to take place. I believe that she had nothing to do with this.
Johnny Hoyt was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole. But for the family of Janora Guillory, no punishment could possibly make up for the pain they suffered in the wake of her murder.
Janora's father died of a broken heart. It was just a very, very difficult time for everyone in that family. I'd like for people to remember Janora as we knew her, warm and happy, and someone who would give the shirt off her back to anyone who needed it. We are all happy to have had our lives enriched by her passage through this life.
For more information on an unexpected killer, go to oxygen.com.
From the 9-1, switch that over, that's the young blonde. I was at the West Coast, now I'm in the East Coast. Saw you on the phone.